can get going. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So welcome to this session of the Research Colloquium. I have the great pleasure of introducing Professor Jasone Cenoz, who is a professor of education at the University of the Basque countries. Her research focuses on multilingual education, bilingualism, multilingualism, and minority languages. She's published a large number of articles and books, such as Pedagogical TransLanguaging, in collaboration with Dirk Gorter for Cambridge University Press. Professor Cenoz has presented her work at conferences and seminars in the US, in Canada, Australia, China, India, Brunei, New Zealand, Singapore, and most European countries. In 2011, she obtained the Spanish Association of Applied Linguistics Award for her book Towards Multilingual Education. And she's on the Book Award Committee of the American Association of Applied Linguistics, AAAL, and has also served as ILA Publications Coordinator for 8 years. She's been a member of the Executive Committee of ISCL and is past president of the International Association of Multilingualism. So please join me in welcoming Professor Cenoz for today's session. Thank you again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate this invitation from Professor Enrica Picardo, and I like being part of this research colloquium. And it is, in a way, I mean, we know that we are not together face to face, but it is also the opportunity of being in different continents, even not only different countries, and still we are able to communicate and to share our experiences about pedagogical translanguaging and other aspects. I'm going to share my screen now. So let's see if it works. Does it go well?
Yeah, it's coming. Yeah, perfect.
As presenter, right? It goes
yeah,
well.
Presenter,
okay.
Yes.
Good, good. So today I'm going to talk about pedagogical translanguaging, core characteristics and practices. And first I'm going to give a little bit of background of the way I understand multilingualism, and we will, yes, a second. Yeah, now it goes. And it is with this, we can say this frame of focus on multilingualism. And it looks first, if we think about multilingualism today, we have on the one hand, the spread of English in education and society. You are in an English speaking context, but of course, English is everywhere. And English in all the spread in contexts where English is not spoken has been amazing in recent years. There is also the recognition of minority languages and their use at the school. I mean, in some contexts, these minority languages have also become quite important at the school. I mean, in the context where I come from, in the Basque country, that is in the Spanish side of the Basque country, because the Basque country is not an independent country. Part of it is in France, part of it is in Spain. And in the Spanish side, in the Basque autonomous community, Basque is used in education in many, I mean, it's the main language of instruction for primary, secondary education, and at university, even for almost 50% of the students. But we can talk about that also later, if you're interested. And another reason why we have multilingualism is because of the mobility of the population. And we know that there is a diversity of home languages. So if we look at this in education, we see that traditionally we have had hard boundaries between languages at school, so that the idea has been that only one language is used at the time, that you have to try in many contexts, you have like one teacher has to be identified with one language, and pretend almost that the teacher is monolingual, even if the teacher is not monolingual, that there is no, try to avoid translation, the syllabuses of the different, even if you have several language classes, I mean, at school, the syllabuses are not coordinated, they are independent, and the idea of ignoring home languages, they are not in the curriculum, so we ignore them. So these are hard boundaries, and we're between languages, one space for each language. And I'm going against that, against the hard boundaries, by looking at different language, by looking at languages in a different way, looking at the relationships between the languages when conducting research, teaching, or assessing different languages, looking at what they have in common. So instead of hard boundaries, talking about soft boundaries. And we are, the idea is that the multilingual speaker has a repertoire and uses that repertoire in a social context. But to use, the idea is to make the most of the multilingual speaker's repertoire. So instead of monolingual views, to go into multilingual views. So what are monolingual views and hard boundaries? We have, for example, that the idea languages contaminate each other. Let's avoid mixing languages, using different resources from other languages and all these things. On the other hand, from a multilingual view, languages reinforce each other. They can reinforce each other. With a monolingual view, we have the aim is balanced multilingualism for all situations. I mean, you are multilingual, you are bilingual if you speak perfectly each of the languages, like, you know, like in all situations. But of course, if we are thinking about several languages also, this is almost impossible. Multilinguals use the languages for different purposes and have different skills, because there may be some registers that we hardly use in one language if we are using several languages. And another monolingual view is the monolingual societies as a reference. And we know that real societies are multilingual, they are not monolingual. We can call this a holistic view, and there are many others, and you will see also many times that there are different ways to call, in a way, similar ideas, but sometimes there is more like a focus on one more than on another, an emphasis on some ideas more than others. But it is this idea that we have to look at multilinguals or plurilinguals as from a holistic perspective, not just as speakers or even deficient speakers of one of the languages. So we can find concepts like multilingual turn, or teaching through a multilingual lens to take into account all these resources multilingual speakers have, or flexible bilingualism, plurilingual approach or plurilingual pedagogies, cross-linguistic pedagogy that is also using the resources in the linguistic repertoire, in the plurilingual repertoire, or translanguaging. But I'm going to focus more on translanguaging now. So if we look at the origin of translanguaging, we see that it comes from the context, or it comes from Wales in the United Kingdom, where it refers to a pedagogical practice which switches the language mode of input and output in bilingual classrooms. In Wales, they have the situation of having Welsh and English. Welsh is the minority language, but it is the language spoken there in that area. And the idea is that a pedagogical practice with using one language for the input and one for the output, more or less. So doing some things in one language, some things in another language. We will look at that in more detail. But the idea with Ken Williams, who was the first to use this term, and it was used first in Welsh before it was used in English. And the idea is that you get a deeper understanding. So requires translanguaging, requires a deeper understanding than just translating, because it moves from finding just parallel words to processing and relaying meaning and understanding. So if for example, students watch a video in one language, but then they have to write a summary or discuss the main points of the video in another language, it is not just translating and looking for words, it's going beyond that. And that is the idea of processing, and that produces a deeper understanding. Together with Dirk Gorter, we have been working on the dimensions of translanguaging, and we distinguish between pedagogical translanguaging and spontaneous translanguaging. Pedagogical translanguaging refers to instructional strategies that integrate two or more languages, and it's a pedagogic theory and practice. The idea is, and the key concept is, that there are instructional strategies, that we use resources from different languages, but they have been planned. It's part of the instruction. And spontaneous translanguaging is the reality of bilingual usage in naturally occurring context where boundaries between languages are fluid and constantly shifting. And this we can find, for example, in the book by Ofelia Garcia and Li Wei. What spontaneous translanguaging, and as I guess that you also use different languages, is when you use, I mean, when you know that your interlocutors are going to understand what you say, you may use different resources from different languages in a spontaneous way, and it works. It can work very well for communication, but it has not been planned in the classroom. It's something, I mean, when you are texting or whatever, or in an informal context, I mean, it's very common to do that. So we have these dimensions of pedagogical and spontaneous translanguaging. But let's look also at something else: translanguaging in Wales and translanguaging in the US, because there are some differences. Ken Williams is the first person to use the term translanguaging. And the idea, I mean, he was looking at classes taught through the medium of Welsh and English, visiting schools in Wales. And he was looking at different strategies observing classes. And he had the idea of identifying successful and planned bilingual pedagogical practices at a school. He was looking at how was this, and he identified some characteristics as calling them translanguaging. When in the same class, Welsh and English were both used and for some activities or other activities, but without a repetition and without translation, and mainly for input and output. And then he proposes, he wrote about it. He also wrote his doctoral thesis about this, and he proposed their extension to other bilingual schools, to other classes. The idea is, okay, this works, this goes well. I can see that the understanding is better, that the students, so let's see this practice of using Welsh and English in the same class, but for input and output. When we look at translanguaging in the US, and of course the most important scholar has been is Ofelia Garcia, and the point of departure is different, because we come from observing natural and planned bilingual communicative practices in different contexts. This is what I have just referred to as spontaneous translanguaging. So they can happen at the school, of course, but it can also happen, it can also be outside school, in any informal context, and it's natural and it has not been planned. This is important. And then define the characteristics, label them as translanguaging, and then propose their legitimization by accepting them at the school. The point is that in the context where Ofelia Garcia works in New York, there is there are lots of people who speak many languages. Of course, New York has many big cities, also of course Toronto and many big cities, but the Spanish Hispanic community is very big, and they can be immigrants who have come from Spanish-speaking countries, from Latin America, and they can be first generation, but they can also be second, third generation, and they use the linguistic practices they use have elements from Spanish and elements from English, and but they communicate in an effective way, mainly informally, using these elements, this practice of the language. So the idea is that they should also be allowed to use this translanguaging at a school, because it could be positive for them, but also they develop some pedagogical translanguaging also. But the idea is also that if they only have a standard English or standard Spanish at school, it's not the way they speak. They may have problems, and it's better to allow to legitimate somehow the way these practices are used, and they go mainly against the standard language also. So there are differences there. As I said, I'm going to talk more about pedagogical translanguaging, but we can represent this as we can say as a continuum, that sometimes pedagogical translanguaging, of course, can include some spontaneous translanguaging in the class, and spontaneous translanguaging can also become pedagogical. So it's not a dichotomy, it's more a continuum. And I'm going to go now into pedagogical translanguaging and the way we work to define it and to see how it is applied in the classrooms and in research. So pedagogical translanguaging, the important thing is that it's planned inside the classroom, and it can refer to the use of different languages for input and output. That would be the Welsh model, but also other planned strategies that are based on the use of students' resources from the whole linguistic repertoire. So it is resources from the whole linguistic repertoire, and they are planned, and they have been planned to use. It can be for the input and the output, or it can be for other purposes. So the type of characteristics, the core characteristics, we could say, are that the type of program, I'm following here what Colin Baker uses as the categories to define different types of bilingual education in his typology, now in the books of foundations of bilingual education, now also with written in collaboration with Wright. And so the type of program is multilingual education and second or additional language education. So the aim of the program would be to become multilingual. The type of a student is multilingual or emergent multilingual. So, and the aims are linguistic and academic. It can be for language classes, but also for content. And the organization that is planned is designed, and the approach is multilingual and heteroglossic. Okay, so this is pedagogical translanguaging, the way it can be defined, but we can have different practices. And these practices, and I'm going to refer here to 4 practices, there could be more. They can be stronger or weaker, and they can be stronger when the intervention, what we do in the class, is more, on the one hand, more intense, we can say, but also more intense in the sense of using the resources from the other languages more intensively in the same class. So we have an enhancing metalinguistic awareness, use of the whole linguistic repertoire, integrated language curriculum, and translanguaging shifts. And I'm going to explain a bit and telling you the way we use them in the classroom. So the first, enhancing metalinguistic awareness, this is what we call a strong form, a strong practice of pedagogical translanguaging. And the idea is that students use 2 or more languages in the same class, and the focus is on analyzing and reflecting on languages cross-linguistically. It is strong because the students, even if it is the English language class, they work with other languages as well in the English language class. That is why the intervention is kind of stronger than if it was doing it only English. And pedagogical translanguaging to become aware of the whole linguistic repertoire. Pedagogical translanguaging can take place at different language levels: phonetics, lexicon, morphology, syntax, pragmatics, discourse. We've been working mainly at the lexicon, morphology, and discourse, but it can take place at other levels also. In all the skills, reading, writing, listening, and speaking, we've been working more on reading and writing. And it is linked to the Welsh concept of translanguaging, but it goes into more practices, and it goes beyond 2 languages also. And it goes into practices that are more specific to raise metalinguistic awareness. And an example of this can be this, studying cognates. For example, and looking, this can take place it depends, it can be the language class, but it can also be a CLIL class where content is taught through the medium of English, like with us in primary school. In some cases, some students have signs in English. So we will have a text like this. It will be, okay, this is the English class, little text, it can be longer, this is just an example, but in English. And then we say, okay, look for words that you can have here. We have the table is completed, but that you can find in other languages. For example, climate can be clima in Spanish and clima in Basque, or affecting, afectando, not in Basque, it's a different word, or continent, continente, continente. Basque is a different language. In the origin, it's not an Indo-European language, and it's not a Romance language coming from Latin either. But you know that there are many technical words and so that can be similar, that are shared also between English and Spanish, for example. And we also add another column for your language to make sure that other home languages, if they are other languages, if there are words, because the students nowadays, we have students who speak other languages. We think, I mean, in texts that are related to science, for example, that making these connections between the different languages can be extremely useful, because even in the case of a language like Basque, and I say it here, that is quite different from other languages, the words that are in green are words that are related to Spanish and English. I mean, even if the origin of the languages is different, but you know that English borrowed many words from Latin and French, and Spanish is a language that comes from Latin, but Basque is not. But still, there are many words that have come from other languages and also from Latin. So here, in a language that is different from Spanish, if I read this, Spanish speakers could understand, say, oh, that word sounds familiar here and there, a few words, but they cannot understand the text. This is, by the way, about the cycle, the water cycle, about when the water is evaporated, you get the clouds and then the rain and so on. We have also worked with the linguistic landscape and looking either taking pictures of the towns or finding pictures on the internet, and looking in this case at compounds, but looking at how in Basque, for example, in this case, it's quite interesting that compounds are more similar in Basque and English than in Spanish. That by the way, is a false friend in this case. So they look at other words, working on vocabulary, how can you say, and then they say like Loradenda, which is flower shop, and so on. I mean, that they find different words. We have also been working with the linguistic landscape to look at the same time, not only at, in this case, it's also compounds, but also about the awareness of the languages in the context. I mean, if they take, for example, this is a picture taken from the street, and this one is from internet or whatever, but how many languages are there? Which languages? What is the order? Talking about the picture, and it can be in, if it is, it can be in another language, like here is in Spanish, here is in English. And then going into the compounds again, like peluquería, ella paintería, that will be in Basque, hairdressers, that is in Spanish. But making, I mean, you may, that you can that the students realize that they can be compounds, that perhaps if they look at them that way, they can figure out what the meaning of the word is, because that is the way languages work, metalinguistic awareness. We have been working also at the discourse level, like for example, if you get to tell a narrative, this is in primary school at a low level, but the elements that you need, like in the title, beginning, middle, action. I mean, there are different ways depending on they can be more or less, or they can the structure, but the structure is basically the same, and it is the same in the three languages that in our context every child has: Basque, Spanish, and English. Some students also have French as an optional subject in secondary, but the structure will be the same. So it is important to work with the three languages following the structure of the narrative at the same time. That is the point, not to have in one language, even if for example, English is a third language for us and the level will be lower, but even if that is the situation and the text is more simple, at least it can have the same structure. And then you don't get the students confused that they are given some instructions about the structure of a narrative text one time, then another time is different because the textbook in Spanish gives a different structure, or in English or whatever, right? So working across the languages. We also see this here, and this is a description and elements of the description. And then after that, they also have to write a description in English. Or when we see how stories can start and they can finish, and to see them in the three languages at the same time to realize what it is like in the three languages. So this would be about raising meta-linguistic awareness, working with the three languages in one class. Now let's look at the use of the whole linguistic repertoire. This, we are talking about students who are encouraged to use 2 or more languages in the same class for different activities, to find sources in different languages, change the languages of the input and the output. This is the closest, or this can be included here, the Welsh way to look at of translanguaging, right? So using the languages, we are not going to focus as much on metalinguistic awareness and the way the language works, but we are going to use the resources of the different languages. The different languages, we can have access to more information, but we're going to process them so that all the languages are used sometimes for the input or for the output. And to give an example of this, I'm going to go back to Williams, to Ken Williams, because he's the one who used it for the first time in Wales. You don't have to read this text, it's just to see what it looks like, what it was about an example from his doctoral thesis, 1994. And this is about the Industrial Revolution in the UK. So first we have a picture that is A. B is a text in English. We don't have to be reading those texts. C is another picture. D is another text in English. And E is a text in Welsh. And there are different activities to do with this. So it's not only, you can see that sometimes the input is in English, as here with a little text here, but sometimes it can be in Welsh. And what is done can be in the other language. So for example, here there is, imagine that you lived in an industrial town during the 19th century, write a diary entry for the 15th July 1845. Remember to include information about the house, street, and town. In order to carry out this task, it is necessary to read the Welsh text, but also the other text. So it can be also the input in more than one language, but to carry out, and this of course sometimes can be done in one language or in the other language. This is more or less the idea. They use the languages in the repertoire to carry out a task, but getting information, it could be in one language, it could be in more languages. Another example, and this is from Garcia, Ibarra, Johnson, and Seltzer, that could be this category, is that from this book, The Translanguaging Classroom, students analyze bilingual public service announcement, and they write bilingual public service announcement in different formats: posters, short dramatic plays, oral presentations in English and Spanish, and explain their choices, some in English, some in Spanish, not a repetition, not a translation, but they look at bilingual, that they are in the two languages, but then they can write, they can do something in one language or they can do it in the other language, okay? But it is a bit of using it's a different way, but using the two languages in the same exercise. Another example is about an exercise about the news in 3 languages. Here on the left, you have a newspaper in Basque, then in Spanish, and then in The Guardian in English. And in this example, that this is something that students did and is reported in an article, is reading the news in Basque, Spanish, English to identify the structure of the articles on the same topic, to see if they are similar, if they are different on the same topic. Then oral summaries have to be in Basque, and then the listening to the news, a listening exercise is in English, and then writing a piece of news can be in Basque, Spanish, English, and there were some students who spoke Arabic, and those could do it also in their language and then explain and what they have been doing, and I mean, explain to the others, so that there's also some awareness of other languages, not only the languages that are in the curriculum, and then discussion and feedback. But it's all this alternating, using different resources, having access, comparing, having all these possibilities. So this is also, and it's a kind of strong form of pedagogical translanguaging, because we are using different languages in the class that used to have only one language before. That's why it's sometimes a bit shocking for teachers, but why this is the English class, or this is the Spanish class, or the Basque class? Why do we have other languages? But we can have, and this happens also in some cases, what is integrated language curriculum. And here Students, this is a weaker form. Students only use the target language in class. So if it is the English class, they will have only everything in English, or the Spanish class, and but the syllabus of the language classes are coordinated so that the languages reinforce each other. Why, you may wonder, why do we think that this can also be regarded as pedagogical translanguaging, even if it is a weak form of pedagogical translanguaging, if each class is in one language? Well, we've been thinking a lot about this, and if we see it from the perspective of the student, if you have in the one before, in the using the whole linguistic repertoire, you could have 20 minutes in one language, for example, because you are reading or listening or writing in one language, and then you have the next 20 minutes in another language. But here, from the perspective of the student, if we look at integrated language curriculum, you could have at 9 o'clock, you are working on something that is completely related to what you're going to do at 10 o'clock in another language. And still you have a different teacher, for example, but you are still doing things that are completely coordinated. And as a whole, from the student's perspective, in those 2 hours or 3 hours, if you have 3 languages, you've been going using the resources from all the languages. So, for example, and this is an article that is from Canada, Lister, Quiroga, and Ballinger, 2013, and from Montreal. And they had in a school, they had this book, Moon Man, and well, there was another one, Crichton, by the same author, and in English and in French. And it was a French immersion class. And what they do, they had a different teacher for English, a different teacher for French, but it was completely coordinated, so that if they were working on some, telling the story in one class, then they went on in the other class and so on. But they were looking at morphological awareness, prefixes and suffixes in French and English. As you can see here, able, unable, believable, unbelievable, aware, unaware, fall, and fall. And in French, honnête, malhonnête, propre, malpropre, poli, malpoli, sain, malsain. So they had that, but they were working with each of the teachers. It's what they call, and Lister, Ballinger, and other authors have also written quite a bit about cross linguistic pedagogy. But this, what they are doing is using metalinguistic awareness, working on morphological awareness with suffixes and prefixes, and this looks like the enhancing metalinguistic awareness. But at the same time, because it is that the classes are coordinated, they are not working comparing on the same table. Let's see how it is in French and English, is that the classes are coordinated. That's why we consider that as also pedagogical translanguaging, but it is, if we are thinking about the strength of the intervention, it is, of course, there is an intervention to coordinate all this. It's not easy, but it is not having the 2 languages in the same class, okay? And they have different teachers. And then we have the 4th type, that is translanguaging shifts. And these are students ask for the translation of a word they do not understand, for example, when reading a text. And the teacher translates the word or gives a short explanation in a class that is not the language of instruction of the class. It's kind of, it happens because there is a shift there, but the teacher can use the opportunity to add an explanation, or to link it to the planned syllabus, or to link it to the word in the other language. So it is bridging a bit between spontaneous and pedagogical translanguaging. This term of translanguaging shifts is also in the book by Garcia Ibarra Johnson and Seltzen, and they refer to several things. But for example, helping individual students with difficult vocabulary by providing translation or using synonyms, cognates, helping students to make sense of new content, and allowing students to talk to one another, or looking up words and phrases in online, using online translation books, I think it says. It's not well written, and encouraging students to relate new content to their own worlds. I mean, they use it in a very wide way for many different activities, but the main will be to use an element from another language, but it has not been completely planned, and we are relating somehow is spontaneous to pedagogical. This is, of course, a weak form of pedagogical translanguaging. It has not been planned before. This is an example from a PhD student of mine who finished her thesis in 2020, Nerea Villabona, and she was observing classes taught through the medium of English content, content classes through the medium of English. This is one of the teachers, teacher 3. And what did you agree? She said it was, and then as there is a silence, she says, agree, adostu. What did you agree? Goes back to English. But this kind of, and then a student says, was the idaskari? This is again, not knowing or remembering that moment the word in English, and it is in Basque. This adostu is agree in Basque, and idaskari is secretary in Basque. Was or will be, okay, so will be the secretary. Yes, and what do you have to do? Can you say it in English, and so on? So this type of shifts that can be used to learn or to with a vocabulary word that could also be translanguaging, but if it's used pedagogically as it is in this example. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about students and teachers feedback that we got, for example, with students feedback in primary school, elementary school, where they were working mainly on enhancing metalinguistic awareness. We had things like some words come from the same word and words are similar in Spanish, Basque, and English. This was kind of surprising for them. How can words be how can words be similar, because we thought they were very different languages? Or did anything surprise you when you work with 2 or 3 languages at the same time? It helped me a lot to learn, to read, and to understand things. We also have teachers' feedback, for example, from the cognates in the science class, and teachers saying more attention was paid to language than in other science classes, obviously, because you are working with language at the same time. And students realized that the knowledge of other languages could help, and students were reading more carefully. And one of the news that we had with the newspapers and the news, they said students learn more because they could see the languages together. Students developed metalinguistic awareness, and students, metalinguistic awareness in this case was mainly at the discourse level about the structure of the news in the different languages. And they realized that languages are not
I think there are some connection problem. Is it just me? Or...
There is a poor connection. I can't see and hear anything.
Yeah, I think the picture of professor is frozen for me at
It's
least.
frozen, yeah. We don't see. So let's wait a minute, maybe. Let's wait if, I don't know if what I don't have her phone number, so what I could do is try to write.
So I think the professor left the.
Yeah, maybe she comes back.
Okay.
It's probably a problem. Let's Zoom recording. There you go.
Okay, sorry, well, I don't know. I think it was my connection that went wrong somehow. I don't know why. Anyway, so the idea that we have is that, I mean, some teachers were saying that it's necessary to make students think of what they previously know about the topic. It's kind of this idea of linking prior knowledge to new knowledge. And the other idea is that sometimes students perhaps are not very good at one language or whatever, but they can offer something because they can link to things they know in other languages. So this is the increasing their self-esteem, and they consider themselves important. So I'm going to go into some final remarks. So not that the idea is that with pedagogical translanguaging, we link prior knowledge to new knowledge by benefiting from multilingual resources. And it reinforces language and content because it integrates core academic language skills also across a curriculum, because we can use a lot mainly it can be the stronger forms of pedagogical translanguaging is to develop academic language that is necessary, completely necessary when it is the medium of instruction. What we have also from Jim Cummings is that he says in his book of 2021, the legitimacy of pedagogical translanguaging is supported by extensive research evidence demonstrating that mobilizing students' multilingual and multimodal repertoires can scaffold students' L2 learning and their understanding of L2 academic content. So it can be used for learning, for content, and it can be used in that way. The idea that we saw at the beginning with focus on multilingualism, we can see that the idea is that the languages are related. Of course, they have many things that are not the same. I mean, not everything can be pedagogical translanguaging, but they have part of the languages can be used more, thinking from using a holistic perspective and working with pedagogical translanguaging. And the idea is that if we have a focus, if we look at from a holistic perspective, a focus on multilingualism, we can develop pedagogies that consider the speaker as multilingual, the multilingual repertoire and the social context, and replace hard boundaries by soft boundaries between languages. But of course, it is true that not everything can be translanguaging, and we need to provide breathing spaces for the L2, L3, L4, the language of instruction, whatever it is. So it is not that all the class or all the classes have to be on this, but we also need breathing spaces for the other languages, and the other languages need to be there also. And regarding the teaching language and teaching content using pedagogical translanguaging, is the importance of that it has to be introduced gradually. For many teachers, it's kind of shocking to use more than one language at a school, at least in our context. And it has to be adapted to existing school pedagogies. And the other thing that is important is that the implementation needs to be tailor-made for a specific context, taking into account the languages used in the wider social context and the aims regarding multilingual competence, which are the aims of the school, and which are the languages that are used and which ones we have to reinforce more at the school, depending on the situation outside the school or which aspects of the languages. So I wanted to, you have already seen some of the articles that you have read. Here are some other articles, and this is the book that is an open access book. It's a very short book that you can also read about pedagogical translanguaging, and even a video that if you go to YouTube and you say, let's make the most of multilingualism, you will find a video where the children are at school and they are in a Basque school and they are working a bit with the cognates and so on. And, oh, sorry, no, this has gone. So that's, okay, and I think that that is what I wanted to tell you, and I want to thank you very much for everything, and I'm ready to, I mean, if you have questions or
Sure.
comments.
Well, first of all, let me thank you for this talk, and which was kind of very comprehensive. And I stopped the recording. Thank you for your time and your patience. And I stopped the recording now because we don't record the QA sessions, so people are. Okay, thank you again. And